So as Thomas mentioned, organizational network analysis is a really exciting area, and hopefully through the case study I'm going to show you something that you can all get excited about and perhaps try to implement in your organizations as well. But my name is Melanie Barrett. I work in the regional people analytics team at Nestle. So we as a team support all of Asia and the Pacific in all things people analytics. And as you can see here today, I'm going to be talking to you about seeing beyond the org chart using organizational network analysis. So before we get into that, though, a little bit of information about Nestle as a company. The most important point on this slide to me is that we have 323,000 employees across 189 countries. And that is important to me because, as you can imagine, that large number of employees generate huge volumes of HR data that I have the great pleasure of analysing on a daily basis. So some of the brands that you might be a little bit more familiar with, Purina, Uncle Toby's, Milo, Nescafe, San Pellegrino, and the brand that I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is Nespresso, which is the encapsulated coffee system business. So before we do that, though, I'd like to do a quick survey. So if you could pop up your hand if you hear a statement that you think applies to you or your organisation. So first up, I depend on my colleagues for information that I need to do my job well. Second, the speed at which decisions are made affects our product, service, customers, or financials. Thirdly, subject matter experts and key contributors are not always recognised by our formal performance management systems or processes. Cool. And lastly, there exists someone whose departure would seriously put ongoing operations at risk. Okay, excellent. So if you put your hand up for one, two, or maybe all four of those statements, I think that organisational network analysis is going to be a topic of interest to you. So collaboration is taking over our workplaces. The amount of time we spend engaged in collaborative work has increased by up to 50% in the last decade and can take up to 80% or more of our time. We're on twice as many teams as we were 5 years ago. And there are even a number of organisations that are redesigning their workspaces to activity-based working in a bid to increase collaboration. So employees foster relationship networks to share information, to acquire knowledge, to innovate, and to get results. These relationship networks are also known as an organisation's social capital. It is through these networks that so much of our work actually gets done. And yet, so little is done to understand these networks. Imagine the perspectives you could gain if you could see and understand them. So traditionally, the HR data that we've used to make important decisions is focused in on human capital data, such as demographics, skills, and experiences. And I think at times this has probably been supported by a little bit of intuition, some gut feel, maybe a few subjective biases. But in today's highly networked team-based organisations, social capital matters more than it ever has before. Research has shown that from a business perspective, social capital increases business performance and productivity. Employees that are able to harness their own social capital get better pay, faster promotions, are more influential, and more efficient. So what is organisational network analysis? I think we have quite a few people in the room who maybe are experts or who understand the topic really, really well. But for those of you that don't, I think you can understand the formal hierarchical org chart that you can see on the left here. What you see on the right is the organisation as it actually functions, as a collaborative network. So organisational network analysis allows you to see and understand who is collaborating with who and gives you a completely different lens through which to understand your organisation. Once you can see and understand these informal networks, you're also able to start to see where you might have bottlenecks or silos happening across the different teams in your organisation. It also allows you to identify key players who play really important roles in these networks, but that maybe aren't recognized as performers in your formal performance management processes. So there are two types of ONA. The first is passive. We scrape and utilize technology data from communication systems like email or calendar data, or maybe data from Skype or Slack, and you use that to understand who is collaborating with who. The second is active organizational and network analysis, where you survey employees to understand who it is that they are collaborating with. Both of these different methods have really different pros and cons. So we embarked on a project with an Nespresso area of our business in early 2019. So the context at Nespresso at the time was a desire to move to a more omni-channel approach. So omni-channel is about creating a consistent and coherent customer experience, regardless of how it is that that customer chooses to engage with your business. So in Nespresso's case, whether that be through a Nespresso boutique, or through a 1-800 number, or through the Nespresso.com website, the idea being that that customer experience should be seamless. So this requires customer centricity, agile decision-making, and most importantly, increased collaboration across all of the commercial teams. Secondly, in line with omnichannel, there was also an organizational realignment that was starting to be planned. And lastly, as the business started to try to become more agile, there was recognition amongst leaders that decision-making wasn't really always going to plan. So as a result of this, the project team were asked to find out where collaborative information sharing was happening, to find out where decisions were being made, and to find out who the key players were across the networks in the commercial space of the business. So in designing our approach, we decided to use active organizational network analysis. We did this because it enabled us to be really focused on information sharing and decision making so that we could understand collaboration from these 2 points of view specifically, which we wouldn't be able to do if we decided to use passive organizational network analysis. So we surveyed all employees that we were targeting using the Microsoft Office 365 survey tool, Microsoft Forms, and asked each of our participants to list up to 10 people that they rely on most to accomplish their work. Then for each of those people that they had listed, how often they go to that person before making a decision, and how often they receive information from that person which they use to accomplish their work. So here, participation rates were really, really critical if we wanted to map these networks accurately. So through clear, consistent, and really strong communication, we were able to achieve a 99% response rate, which was a lot more than we had ever hoped for. I think the employees were really interested in seeing what the outcomes of the project would be, which was great. Once we collected all the data, we did the analysis in R, which is a statistical programming language. For those of you that don't have programming skills in your teams, there are other software technologies that can be used for this kind of analysis, like Microsoft Power BI or open source software such as Gephi. There are also a growing number of external vendors that will do this type of analysis for you. We have 2 of them here, Polynode and Swoop, as well, if you want to go and have a chat to them.
Melanie, quick question.
Yes.
That's a massive response rate, obviously.
Yes.
Why, can you go deeper into why you thought that was? How many people, was it the nature of the questions? Was it the quality of the communication that you all put forth in achieving that rate?
Yeah, of course. I put it down mostly to the communication. We communicated consistently right from the early stages of the project.
Yeah.
And we communicated really clearly about what we were trying to get out of the project.
Okay.
And I think employees really bought into what we were trying to achieve,
yeah,
and were interested in what the results would be for them, their own teams, and across the function as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah. So through the analysis, we looked at 3 main things. The first thing is centrality. So centrality is a measure of the influence of a person in the network or how connected they are. There are a number of different types of centrality in graph theory. We decided to use eigenvector centrality, which takes into account how connected your connections are. So if you're connected to a highly connected person, that increases your own connectedness just in and of itself, which I think makes sense. We also looked at network maps where we plotted people and their relationships. I'm going to show you a few of those shortly and some of our findings. We also looked at department interconnectivity. So we took it up a level and looked at team-to-team or department-to-department collaboration as well, rather than just at a person-to-person level. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is our first network map. There's a lot going on here. I'm going to break it down and explain it to you. So this is the network map of all of the people that responded to our survey. Each dot or node is a person. Their eigenvector centrality is represented by the size of the node. So the larger the node, the more connected that person is. The relationship is indicated by the line that connects the two nodes. Although it's hard to see, it's actually an arrow, so it's giving you the direction of that relationship. And then lastly, the color of the node represents the team that that person comes from. So as I mentioned earlier, the focus for this project was on the commercial areas of our business. So this map zooms in and focuses on just those teams, making analysis a little bit easier on this occasion. This is an information network map, so it's focusing in on the question, how often do you receive information from this person to do your job well? We did the same thing with decision-making network maps, where we mapped based on the question, how often you receive, how often you go to a person before making a decision, and we analysed the two different sets of maps separately. So when we analysed this particular map, some of the things that we expected to see were that Team D, shown there in green, and Team K, shown there in yellow, would be at the centre of this map and highly connected into all of the other teams. This is because those two teams are shared commercial services, and the purpose of the teams is to share information across the network. As you can see, instead, what we found is that neither of those two teams are at the centre of the map, and actually, neither of the two teams have any connections into the two biggest commercial teams in the function, which is really problematic. Instead, what you see, they're walled off by Team F, they're shown in red, meaning that any information sharing that they're doing across this network is going through Team F as an intermediary, or maybe isn't actually happening at all, which in our case was really problematic. Next, we zoomed in on Team B, shown here in blue at the bottom, and we found that this team was broken into two small clusters. These clusters actually represented geographical boundaries, where the cluster on the left was the employees based in Australia, and the cluster on the right is the employees based in New Zealand. The two clusters are joined by one relationship network, meaning that if either of the people in that relationship were to be moved into other teams or were to leave the business, there'd be no collaborative information sharing happening at all between the two clusters of this one team, which again also, in our case, was a highly problematic finding. So here's some work we did to look at team collaboration. So here you see each bar representing a team, the light blue portion representing the percentage of time that they spend collaborating internally with other members of their own team. The grey portion of the bar is showing you the percentage of time that they spend collaborating externally with other people outside of their own team. So if we take a look at Team M at the top there, we can see that they are spending almost 74% of their time collaborating internally with other members of their own team. In this case, I should say that that's not always going to be a problem, but in this case, given the function of Team M, this was not at all actually what we expected to see. Next, we broke down that external portion so we could see the teams that each of the teams were actually collaborating with. And we were looking for particular patterns where we saw particular teams collaborating with each other. And in some cases, they were collaborating at the right levels that we would expect to see. And in some cases, to a much lower level, and in some cases, not at all. Depending on the situation and depending on the teams and what we expected to see was whether we decided if that was actually problematic or not. And this added additional information to what we'd already found from analysing the network maps as well. What was really interesting was at the beginning of this project, there'd been an intuition from our leaders that there were silos happening across the commercial function. Our analysis had now given us facts that we could use to try to drive change. So lastly, here's some work that we did to identify key players. So the y-axis gives you the volume of incoming information requests. The x-axis is giving you the volume of outgoing information requests. And the diagonal line is then showing you where outgoing and incoming information requests are equal. We were then able to label the top 10% of information sources and the top 10% of information seekers. We then labeled our top right-hand corner as our highly connected hubs, as these people both seek and share really high volumes of information across this network. If any of these highly connected hubs were to leave the business, it would likely have an impact on business operations. What was interesting was that when we analysed the names in this group of highly connected hubs, not all of them were recognised as high performers through our formal performance management processes. What was also interesting is that quite a lot of them were people managers, where I think maybe you'd expect them to be collaborating at a high level due to the traditional role that they have, collaborating with their own teams, collaborating with other people managers. But there were actually quite a few junior employees as well in that group that I guess were more adept at collaborating and information sharing and building relationship networks as a function of their personalities rather than of their traditional roles. So once we'd consolidated all of our findings, we turned our attention to the organisational realignment. Once the to-be state org charts had been mapped out, we produced network maps of the to-be state org structures showing collaboration that would be happening in these future to-be states. This allowed us to spot issues and identify them early. An example is shown here where members of 4 different teams were being brought together to create one new team. So the colour of the node is representing the team that they are coming from. And what we found here was if you look at the small cluster of people in green at the bottom from Team D, they had no connections at all into the team that they were going to be becoming a part of. So these to-be state network maps were provided to the managers of the newly created teams, and change management activities were planned out according to the needs of each of the new teams as well. Key players who we had identified earlier were then utilised in these change management activities as we went forward. So at the end of the project, there were 2 main key takeaway areas for the team at Nespresso. The first was in alignment to strategy. So as the business tried to move to a more omni-channel approach, it became clear from our analysis that current working patterns were really falling short of this. While there'd been an intuition that there were silos happening across the commercial function, we'd given them facts that they could really use to drive change. Secondly, in the space of change management. So as we moved towards our impending org realignment, we were able to use the collaboration networks and the information to trouble spot and find issues so that change management activities could be put in place and key players could be used and deployed into these change management activities as well. In terms of next steps, we plan on surveying the same group of employees 12 months on from when the original survey was done so that we can track change management efforts. The business also, toward the end of last year, got a new business head who started. And the network maps were provided to him as part of his onboarding and induction into the business as well. And his feedback about the network maps was that they were invaluable in helping him to understand his business to a really great depth. And he felt that all business leaders should be provided with such information when they're starting and trying to understand their business to any great kind of detail. So that is everything I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much for your time.
You have some time for questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right. We do have some time for questions. Anyone have a question? Because I have like 8. So I'm just going to... How many people in the espresso business?
About 850.
850? Okay. I'll just ask one at a time. So ONA is a method, right? And as we talked about at the outset of the day, there's a host of methods that could have been employed to get to this insight.
Definitely.
However, you prioritized O&A and said, okay, this is the best way. Can you talk about your thinking? Did you actually say, okay, we should do O&A and find a place for it to live and deliver value? Or was it quite the opposite? You saw a problem and said, okay, O&A is the best suited method by which to answer that question?
Yeah, it was definitely the latter. So we understood the problem at Nespresso, particularly the idea that they had silos across their business and it was stopping them from achieving this more omni-channel approach that they were trying to move toward. So understanding silos, we knew that O&A would be a really good technique to use to see those. And particularly with the org realignment that they were going to go through, we knew that O&A could also help in that kind of space. So it really it made sense as the right technique to use.
And it took you as an analyst the awareness to know that that was an option, right?
Yes, definitely.
Because one of the things I want to call out for all of us is in my language that we use, we all have our structures of interpretations. In other words, my background is economics. So I look at solving problems via the techniques that I've been exposed to. And we're all both enabled by that background, yet we're also hindered by that background because we might not be aware of certain ways to do things. So can you speak to your background and some of the other ways of getting to insight that you have used or you hope to use in the future?
Yeah, certainly. So I think like a lot of the other speakers, I have a background in psychology as well. So O&A has always been a real topic of interest and something that I have always wanted to use, as you'd mentioned, but finding the right business problem to solve using it was much more important than just kind of using it willy-nilly because it's something that I really wanted to do. Yeah.
Got it.
We have used, we're doing a lot of work in the D&I space at the moment, particularly in pay equity. We've done a project at the moment looking at new hires coming into the business to understand if we are bringing a pay inequality from other businesses into our business by asking candidates how much they currently earn. Because if pay inequality exists in other businesses, then we could be bringing it in potentially. So using some correlation studies, identifying that we weren't actually doing that, which was a great news, so we could continue on our practices of asking what current salaries were as we brought people in, which was a really good project.
This was obviously active O&A.
Yes.
Passive O&A, do you have a position on that? Do you foresee using it in the future? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Yeah, certainly. So we're about to start a passive O&A project in South Africa. When talking to the business, their preference was to use passive. They feel like their employees in that area of our business are a little bit over-surveyed and that perhaps the active O&A approach wouldn't work as well in that space. So using a passive made more sense when looking at their business problem.
Outstanding.
So definitely, yeah.
Look forward to hearing how that goes.
I'm really interested in the Nespresso business. I've got two questions. The first one, the groups of people that you speak about, do they actually sit in pods? So sorry, that's the first one. The second question is, was there any correlations with those that networked really well? So you did touch on it around personalities or something like that. Did you actually get to the details of what the similarities were?
Between the people that were highly connected?
Yeah, what makes a good networker?
We didn't look at that so much. We probably need a little bit more data, but we're wanting to look at correlating people's centrality with their talent rating to see if we are in the right space in terms of our talent management processes. But we didn't, because I think the data set wasn't quite big enough to do any kind of other correlation at this stage, but yeah.
It's as the mic goes over here, it's a really good question. This will be our final question. Just around here, Bruce. There's a large organization in California, which we all know the name of, that actually their diversity metrics improved at a macro scale. But as it got deeper into the organization, there were just clusters of diversity groups. So to your point, like there are just people who liked one another for whatever reason that were clustered in these, embedded in the organization. So at a macro level, they look good, but really the organization wasn't as diverse as they actually thought it was. It wasn't have good integration. Last question.
I'm Melanie from SOVA. That was really good, Melanie. It was interesting you were saying that you're valuing people through this research you're doing, that you're valuing people who are not usually recognised in the performance matrix. So I was wondering if you're going to start using this for part of your performance matrix in the future. And also you mentioned that it was a risk to the organisation if they weren't retained, which would sort of lead to engagement type questions.
Yeah, certainly. One of the issues with active O&A is that the data is quite static because you're surveying employees at a point in time. So understanding their centrality 6 months down the line might have completely changed. So we would need to be able to scale it to be able to use it, I think, effectively for performance management, rather than just the small area of the business that we were looking at in this case. We'd probably need to scale up and use passive, which is understanding employees' collaboration on an ongoing basis all the time, to be able to use it for those purposes.
All right. Well, again, let's give Melanie a round of applause. Appreciate it. Well done. Real done.